for reconciliation and surrender. But Sri Lanka seems to have decided in this case that the special circumstances of the conflict with the Tigers made that inadvisable. As we've already talked about before today, in the past the Tigers had repeatedly exploited international concern and used ceasefires to gain breathing space. And they would simply use that opportunity to rebuild their forces, re-engage, and gain a breathing space from the pause by the government. In this case, the government decided that it couldn't afford to continue to do that. And so it ignored international calls for restraint and focused completely on destroying the military forces of the insurgency. The government displayed, in this case, unshakable political will, opposing all external and internal pressure for a ceasefire. Now, that political top cover provided the time, space, and support that was needed for the free execution of the strategy which we just talked about, which is very enemy-centric. But again, I'd point out that it's somewhat controversial, but also unusual. Most governments engaged in a counterinsurgency, most political leaders, do not engage with such a high degree of determination. It's very unusual to do that. I think the nation of Sri Lanka is very lucky in its armed forces, but the armed forces in this case are also very lucky in the political leadership that they had in this particular campaign. I think the government clearly assessed accurately the Tigers' strategic weaknesses and aggressively sought to exploit them by attacking the base of the Tigers' material and political support and using their conventional tactics to destroy the Tigers' fighting capability. Importantly, too, the Tigers contributed to their own downfall by exploiting and abusing the Tamil population, by destroying whatever local credibility that they may have retained after 25 years of conflict. In essence, the Sri Lankan government exploited its advantages to out-adapt and to out-compete the Tamil Tigers. This whole sequence of discussion, which I've just brought up, has led some people in the counterinsurgency community to ask some significant questions about whether the basic precepts of classical counterinsurgency, as understood in the West, still apply. Now, that theory, as laid out originally by David Galula, by Robert Thompson, and by others, and in fact Professor Hashim here has been a major contributor to thinking about counterinsurgency. This strategy advocates protecting the population and focusing on political primacy as a means to win over the population, to isolate the insurgent, and forge a lasting peace. Now, Sri Lanka, in this case, chose a different path, somewhat in contradiction to these prescriptions. And in this case, it seems to have produced both quick and decisive results. So I'd like to take a minute to address some of the issues that apparent contradiction raises. Firstly, I think counterinsurgency is, at its heart, a counter-adaptation battle, a struggle to develop and apply new techniques in a fast-moving, high-threat environment against an enemy that's continually updating and developing. An effective counterinsurgency strategy depends on the nature of the counterinsurgent, the nature of the insurgent enemy with whom we're fighting, and the nature of the population group within which the conflict is taking place. Counterinsurgency isn't defined by any one single specific set of techniques. It's rather any combination of techniques that's used to deal with a particular insurgency under particular circumstances. I think Sri Lanka's approach here embodied that principle. It recognized that the Tigers were operating in a conventional manner, that they were hierarchical, and that they were actively alienating significant portions of the Tamil population. And therefore, conventional attack, defeating the Tigers with a conventional approach, became possible. The population-centric approach of classical coin theory, as used in Iraq and Afghanistan, is a response to quite a different type of insurgent threat. The Taliban in Afghanistan, for example, are not trying to defeat the Afghan government in open battle in a symmetrical, conventional fight. Instead, they're using asymmetric threats, terrorist attacks, but more importantly, the control of the population through programs at the village level, competitive governance, as it's called, to undermine the government and to discredit the international community. Against that type of group, conventional military operations would be ineffective and counterproductive. There's no big center of gravity, no fixed area to attack in a similar way to the late phase of the campaign in Yelam 4. A population-centric approach that seeks to provide sustainable security, to improve community resiliency and create a responsive government stands a higher chance of success in that set of circumstances. I want to now talk briefly about human rights concerns. We've already mentioned this morning the United Nations Secretary General's panel of experts report on accountability. It is, of course, only the latest in a series of reports detailing potentially serious human rights abuses by both the Tigers and the government. And similar questions of abuse have been raised by organizations around the world. Many accounts from different sources have shown a pattern of similar allegations against both the Tigers and the government, including things like allegedly indiscriminate fire on civilians or refugees, extrajudicial killings of surrendering forces, denial of humanitarian assistance in conflict zones, human rights violations outside the conflict zone, both before, during, and after hostilities. Allegations against the Tigers in particular include using civilians as human shields, murdering civilians trying to flee the conflict area, as we saw on the video earlier today, detention, torture, and execution of civilians and unarmed prisoners of war, forced recruitment and use of children as child soldiers and suicide bombers, forced enslavement of civilians in conflict zones, and the killing of civilians through suicide attacks and other acts of terrorism. So I think it's important not to come up with some kind of moral equivalency here, but it's also important not to sweep under the rug specific allegations. For example, the alleged shelling of the no-fire zone in Moletivu district, which I believe contributes to a view among some well-placed observers that the government, too, has engaged in some abuses. Reports from NGO and UN staff, as we've talked about today, have detailed shelling of hospitals, for example, throughout the area, injuring and killing large numbers of civilians. Now, as I noted earlier, I'm an outsider. You guys live here. I'm just visiting. But even I have no illusions about the extreme brutality of the Tamil Tigers in their 25 years of atrocious violence against the Sri Lankan people. Again, as an outsider, though, I have to say it's very unlikely that the international community is going to adopt Sri Lanka's model without first wanting to talk in detail about these allegations. I think that Sri Lanka actually has a very solid case, quite a solid argument to make. I don't think Sri Lanka has anything to fear from engaging in this kind of debate, and I think it would actually be very healthy to move the discussion forward. It comes down to the trade-off that's inherent in fighting such an implacable and abusive enemy as the Tamil Tigers. I think that Sri Lanka could put forward a very solid argument that it did whatever it took to defeat this type of enemy, and that doing that and thereby ending the conflict was morally justifiable in the special circumstances where the enemy used civilians as human shields. A government that gives in to an enemy that continues to use that tactic may simply be prolonging the campaign, and ultimately this may result in more human lives being lost. Sometimes you may need to act firmly in order to end the conflict and thereby prevent the enemy from reusing the tactic once again. Again, I think that's why this conference is a good idea. These are issues that the international community has serious and legitimate questions about, and I think Sri Lanka has good answers to those questions. So having the discussion is in everybody's interests. Let me give you one example where I think that the Sri Lankan armed forces grappled very effectively with those issues in dealing with a complex problem, and I'm talking about the Sri Lankan Navy facing these Sea Tiger boats moving up and down the coast, where the Navy showed great restraint in approaching Sea Tiger boats that were hiding among civilian refugee vessels, putting their own vessels at risk to positively identify Sea Tiger vessels before firing. I think the Sri Lankan army faced a very similar situation at Moletivu, and I think there's very good evidence that the army made significant efforts to evacuate as many as possible non-combatant civilians from the area without allowing the Tigers to escape. Use of force against non-combatant civilians may help to defeat a ruthless enemy. who uses them as shields, but it can also have very negative consequences on the long-term resolution of the conflict. Violence against civilians, of course, breeds resentment and hatred towards the government, and this tends to be exacerbated in the long run unless there's a public process of accountability and reconciliation. In that light, the provisions of international law about treatment of non-combatants can be seen not as restrictions that limit the way we operate, but in fact as key tools that allow us to operate in such a way as to be conducive to long-term strategic success by laying the foundations for a later reconciliation. So I'd like to talk now about that third issue, the issue of reconciliation towards a sustainable peace. Even if a military strategy shows great respect for a civilian population, there are limits, as we all know as military people, to the ability of a military force to solve counterinsurgency conflicts. As I mentioned before, insurgencies are the outgrowth of political and economic grievances against the government on the part of a local population that's being exploited by a manipulative armed actor. Military strategy may reduce the effectiveness of an insurgent enemy, but an end to insurgent violence doesn't necessarily indicate an end to the conflict. A stark disparity in military power between the government and a defeated insurgency can temporarily suppress that insurgent violence, but at the same time it can be failing to promote long-term peace. If the original grievances that are driving the conflict remain, then the incentive for violence will also remain. The only thing that stops the violence on any given moment is the power of the government vis-à-vis the defeated insurgency. And as soon as